Good afternoon, everyone. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will now come to order. Subcommittee's meeting today to hear testimony on H.R. 160, the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking member or their designees. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and helps members keep their schedules. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of this hearing, whichever comes first. And hearing no objection, that is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, and motions must be submitted to the electronic repository. The email address for that is hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note, as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff, but only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses who experience any technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. So I will begin this hearing by recognizing myself for an opening statement. And I do want to wish a very early good morning to those of you who are joining us from across the Pacific. I'm very pleased we have witnesses and representatives from Hawaii, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, and Florida. This represents most of the coral reef hotspots in the United States. Now, this subcommittee covers a lot of ground, and it includes diverse and sometimes simultaneous crises. One of our next hearings, for example, will be about the deepening drought in California and the western United States. We also have jurisdiction over a wide array of foundational ecosystems, and we repeatedly hear that ecosystem after ecosystem is struggling or imperiled. And in every case, one of the main culprits is climate change. So, of course, we will keep working on the triage side of these challenges, from drought to massive losses of coral and kelp forests to the extinction crisis. But we have to remember the essential context for all of this, and that is a challenge to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere. That is what is causing so much of this chaos. How many more canary in the coal mine examples do we need? Since the 1930s, the Gulf Coast has lost coastal wetlands the size of Delaware. In the last century, the world has lost 85% of its oyster reefs. In my district, much of the West Coast has seen kelp forests vanish in a few short years. On the north coast of California alone, we've lost 90% of bull kelp. Now, this has significant impacts for coastal ecosystems, and it's very hard on the communities and businesses that depend on them. These ecosystem crashes and the destruction that they bring to communities across the United States are not one-off events. And so I will continue to work to address the climate crisis. We must do everything in our power to give these ecosystems a fighting chance to recover, adapt, and survive for the sake of our communities and our planet. Now, the challenge that brings us together today is the coral reef crisis. Climate change is warming our oceans, stressing corals, causing widespread bleaching events. Ocean acidification is damaging the structural integrity of reefs, and stronger, more frequent storms are destroying reef structure too. Coral disease and poor water quality are additional stressors that can lead to coral reef loss. This is a big deal for coastal economies and for people's livelihoods in places like Florida, Hawaii, the Caribbean, and our Pacific Insular areas. U.S. coral reefs cover more than 4 million acres. These ecosystems support an estimated 25% of all marine life, and communities depend on them for storm protection, income, a source of food, recreation, and tourism. Coral reefs are culturally important to indigenous communities. Now, most Americans may think of the bleaching crisis as something that happens in the Great Barrier Reef, but they need to understand that we are experiencing our own crisis right here off our own shores. The third largest reef tract in the world, extending 300 miles just off the coast of Miami and the Florida Keys, is only at 2% coral cover. That's down from historic levels of 25 to 40%. This reef tract is now suffering from a massive outbreak of stony coral tissue loss disease, which scientists are still trying to fully understand and manage. Now, over 2 decades ago, Congress saw some of this problem coming, and it passed the Coral Reef Conservation Act to create conservation, research, and grant programs at NOAA to protect, conserve, and restore our nation's coral reefs. That authorization expired in 2005. So it's time for Congress to act again and to act boldly before it is too late. Today, I'm pleased that we have a bipartisan bill before us, the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act, led by Congressman Soto. This bill would reauthorize and update the Coral Reef Conservation Act. It seeks to better address issues of climate change, ecosystem loss, emergencies, and disease outbreaks, builds on local, state, and national partnerships that are fueling coral reef conservation and management activities, and promotes local investment in reef management, protection, and restoration. The bill establishes state block grants, which include the Ruth Gates Coral Reef Conservation Grant Program to fund ecosystem conservation and restoration projects. And it also creates a new fellowship program to foster a new generation of coral reef stewards. This is called the Susan L. Williams National Coral Reef Management Fellowship. Both of these programs are named after renowned marine scientists, but Susan was also a constituent of mine and a scientist and former director of the Bodega Marine Lab in my district, and so that's especially meaningful. While there need to be many changes that we will go into in this bill, maybe not many, but some, we start with a very important need, and I'm glad to see Congressman Soto stepping up and providing leadership with this legislation. So we'll have a chance to deliberate on the pros and cons, hear from experts, and I want to thank everyone for participating in this hearing. I will now turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. Ranking Member Benz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So today's hearing will focus on bipartisan legislation aimed at expediting coral reef restoration. 3 Republican subcommittee members, Congressman Daniel Webster, Congresswoman Amada Radawaygan, and Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, are co-sponsors of the bill. As they know, coral reefs can provide multiple benefits, from enhancing fisheries to helping protect coastlines from storm flooding and erosion. In the U.S., reefs are found in both state and federal waters, thus requiring a cooperative partnership. The law this bill amends and reauthorizes expired some 17 years ago. Even though the law's programs still receive appropriations, the bill's authors and supporters have proposed a restructuring of the Coastal Reef Conservation Act with the goal of giving states, U.S. territories, and local communities more autonomy and flexibility in coral reef protection and restoration efforts. Other changes supporters maintain will lead to leveraging increased non-federal dollars for reef restoration. I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about the opportunities and challenges associated with coral reef protection and restoration and how this legislation impacts those efforts. In particular, however, I want to thank Mrs. Radawaygan for bringing her witness, Ms. Kelly Anderson Tagarino, to the table for today's purposes, to the hearing on WebEx. And also, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter of support from U.S. Senator Marco Rubio for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. In the same way that our coastal communities have their needs, so do our Western communities. With that, I once again want to take this opportunity to highlight our Western states are experiencing record drought. And Mr. Chair, I'm very happy to hear you mentioned that we're going to have a hearing. Of course, this situation needs the attention of this subcommittee. I note that my subcommittee staff asked the majority staff over 2 weeks ago to add legislation offered by Mr. Valadeo and others to this hearing agenda. That didn't happen, and that's a bit disappointing. But I'm happy for the hearing that's, as I understand it, scheduled for May 25th. Mr. Chair, I just want to emphasize again in these few minutes the incredible number of people affected by this drought. It's somewhere between 40 and 70 million people in the Western United States. And so I wish, and I'm certain most of them do, or many of them soon will, that we hear as much as we can about the challenges that face us and what we can do about them. And I look forward, as I'm sure they do, to the hearing on, as I understand it, May 25th. And once again, I look forward to the testimony of the day of those appearing before us on this other most interesting issue and important issue. Thank you so much. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. And for our first panel today, we will hear from the sponsor of H.R. 160, Congressman Darren Soto. After his testimony, we will have a second panel with invited witnesses, and I will introduce them and actually ask some of our members to help me in introducing them at that time. So let me remind all the witnesses that under our committee rules, we ask them to limit their oral statements to 5 minutes. Of course, an extended statement longer than that can appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer, of course, will start running, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute left. I recommend that all members and witnesses remotely lock the timer on their screen so they can see it as they testify. After the testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself and avoid any inadvertent background noise. Congressman Soto, thank you for bringing this bill to us today, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and fellow colleagues of the Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife for the opportunity to be able to discuss the bipartisan Restoring Resilient Reefs Act. I want to particularly thank as well fellow committee members, Resident Commissioner Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, Delegate Radwagon, Representative Case, Representative San Nicolas, Plaskett, and Representative Webster for all their support in this key bill, as well as Senators Rubio and Schatz in the Senate, among other members. I should note that the bill passed at the end of last year out of the Senate, something that doesn't happen all the time. So it shows we do have a pathway forward. We have over 10 major coral reef systems in the United States. America's reefs are under threat like others across the world. And it's fitting to review the challenges our reefs face in the Natural Resources Committee, since some are in states, but so many more are in America's reefs are located in our territories. I wanted to briefly show you all the map that you could see here across both the United States and in our Pacific Island territories of how widespread they are. We have the Great Florida Reef, the third largest coral barrier reef system, as the chairman noted, the Hawaiian Coral Reef, the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands Reef, the Papaha Nau Moku Keha, which I'm sure Representative Case can pronounce much better than I can, Marine National Monument. In Texas and Louisiana, we have the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. The Puerto Rico has the Isla Verde Coral Reef Marine Reserve, Virgin Islands Coral Reef National Monument, the National Park of American Samoa. Northern Mariana Islands has some of the oldest, most developed reefs in their southern islands, as well as diverse reefs in Saipan, as well as Guam being mostly surrounded by reefs and coral gardens, including in deeper waters among Pacific remote areas. You can see our coral reefs are under attack by ocean acidification and warming seas caused by climate change, as well as wastewater pollution. In turn, these challenges make America's coral reefs more vulnerable to coral bleaching, stony coral tissue loss disease, among others. Here's an example from the USGS that you can see right here of reefs over time for the Great Florida Reef, a decline from 1971 to 1988 to 1998 to 2004. The USGS went on to state in its assessment, like many reefs around the world, Florida's reefs have experienced significant coral loss in recent decades from coral bleaching, disease, and human-related disturbances. We see declines also as well on the Hawaiian coral reef, as you can see by another photo by the USGS right here. Coral reefs along the densely populated shorelines of Hawaii are especially vulnerable to the effects of ocean acidification amplified by local pollution. Corals around the world are stressed by ocean acidification, and it goes on to talk about the low pH groundwater discharging along shallow coral reefs. Again, our USGS at work. The Restoring Resilient Reefs Act restores the Coral Reef Conservation Program, which expired 15 years ago, maintains NOAA Coral Reef Program while introducing overdue improvements to coral management, restoration efforts, and giving innovative new tools to partners who are closest to this crisis: states, territories, tribes, communities, and universities. Key provisions: a 5-year authorization with explicit focus on restoration activities where national disasters and human activities have degraded. This will help with current funding of $33 million in 2021, but without further direction, we lack the focus It also creates a block grant program where states and territories receive federal matching funds. This will be key for intergovernmental partnerships. It allows for the formation of public-private partnerships for coral management called coral stewardship partnerships. Public-private partnerships are critical for sharing of research. It authorizes the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force to ensure states, territories, and other stakeholders continue to have a voice in U.S. coral management because public feedback is essential. It establishes a single streamlined set of guidelines for action plans to implement a national strategy. These plans will help focus those restoration efforts, as well as allows for emergency grants and emergency funding for coral reef disasters such as hurricanes, typhoons, tsunamis, as well as oil spills and other major events. Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and my colleagues for the opportunity to speak to you about this today.
Thank you, Congressman Soto. I applaud you for leading on this important issue, and really want to thank you and your staff for continuing to work with the subcommittee staff on some of the technical details that we'll be talking about, I'm sure, as we engage with the witnesses here in a moment, but we appreciate that collaboration. We'll now transition to the second panel. Several of our members have constituents who are testifying today, and so I'll allow them each 30 seconds to introduce those witnesses. Our witness from the administration will be Ms. Jennifer Koss, Director of the Coral Reefs Program at NOAA. Next, we will hear from Dr. Robert Richmond. And when it comes time for Mr. Richmond, I will ask Congressman Case of Hawaii, who definitely knows how to pronounce that very complicated national monument that Mr. Soto took a good stab at. But we'll ask him to introduce Dr. Richmond. Following him will be Ms. Fran Castro. And I understand that Mr. San Nicolas was going to introduce her. He may not be able to join us, though. So I may be introducing Ms. Castro. And then next will be Dr. Andrew Baker, a professor of the Department of Marine Biology and Ecology at the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science at the University of Miami. Final witness today will be Mrs. Kelly Anderson Tagarino, and Congresswoman Radawagan will be introducing her. So just a reminder to all the witnesses, after your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself and avoid any inadvertent background noise. I'll also ask the entire panel to testify before we bring it back to the members for questions. So the chair now recognizes Ms. Koss to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jennifer Koss, and I'm the Director of the Coral Reef Conservation Program in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act of 2021, HR 160, which reauthorizes NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. Established in 2000, the Coral Reef Conservation Program brings together expertise from across NOAA to improve the scientific understanding of coral reef ecosystems. Coral reefs are the crown jewels of America's waters, from the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands to the traveling scuba clubs across our nation to the vibrant communities of South Florida and the Caribbean. Coral reef ecosystems underpin cultural identity and a sense of place for countless Americans. U.S. coral reefs reduce coastal flooding, in essence protecting coastal infrastructure, valued at an estimated $1.8 billion across the United States every year. In addition to coastal resilience and protection, healthy coral reefs provide valuable ecosystem services to the American public, including food, opportunities for recreation and tourism, and raw materials used to create pharmaceutical products. I thank the subcommittee and the sponsors of HR 160 for recognizing that threats to coral reefs have increased since the enactment of the Coral Reef Conservation Act of 2000. Pollution, fishing impacts, warming waters, ocean acidification, and other stressors have accelerated the decline of coral reefs worldwide. We currently have 22 species of corals listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. From 2014 to 2017, coral reefs experienced unprecedented losses during a global bleaching event. Additionally, stony coral tissue loss disease continues to spread and cause high rates of mortality to coral populations throughout the wider Caribbean region and may well pose a threat to the Indo-Pacific region as well. NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program is leading the response to the disease. We and our partners are working very closely together to identify the pathogen, treat effective corals, and rescue and breed threatened species. Our experience has shown that the speed with which NOAA can respond after an emergency is critical to the survival of damaged coral reefs. It is with these threats in mind that we reviewed HR 160. The Restoring Resilient Reefs Act directs NOAA to develop a national coral reef resilience strategy, provide block grants to states and territories, establish standards for the formation of stewardship partnerships, and establish a national coral reef management fellowship program. The bill also importantly codifies the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force. While the administration has not yet taken a position on this bill, NOAA appreciates the integration of coral restoration throughout the bill and the critical role restoration plays in a comprehensive conservation strategy to recover lost ecosystem functions and reef resilience. We offer recommendations to more closely align the bill with the Biden administration's priorities on advancing socioeconomic equity, environmental justice, and climate resilience. The first recommendation relates to Section 207, which creates new state block grants. The block grants appear to incentivize coral jurisdictions to provide non-federal sources of funding that the federal government could match. Under the proposed formula, territories with smaller budgets and less philanthropic and nonprofit support would receive less federal funding than states with greater means to directly support coral conservation work. NOAA currently provides equitable support to all 7 jurisdictions by offering partial match waivers to all territories based on need and competitive priorities. NOAA therefore suggests modifying the state block grants formula similar to NOAA's existing approaches to achieve a more equitable distribution of resources. Second, we note that Section 215C authorizes the establishment of cooperative institutes in the Pacific and Atlantic. NOAA already conducts coral reef research in the geographic regions described by HR 160 through our existing cooperative institutes portfolio. Those are the Joint Institute of Marine and Atmospheric Research at the University of Hawaii and the Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Studies, which is a consortium of 10 universities spanning Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss with the subcommittee our plan for implementing Section 215C, given the established capacities within the existing cooperative institutes. Again, we appreciate that Congress recognizes the importance of our nation's coral reefs and NOAA's efforts to protect and restore them. Thank you very much to the subcommittee for the invitation to testify, and I greatly look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koss. I will now go to Congressman Ed Cates to introduce Dr. Richmond. Dr. Cates, are you with us? And will you just pronounce that national monument for us one more time?
Thank you. And Mr. Soto did a pretty good job, actually, I must say. Thank you, Chair, Ranking Member, colleagues on the committee. I'm honored to introduce to you Dr. Robert Richmond, who is a research professor and director at the Kewalo Marine Laboratory, Pacific Biosciences Research Center of the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I can actually almost see Dr. Richmond's laboratory, which is right on the Pacific Ocean, and a good place to check out if you're ever in Hawaii, by the way, for world-class research and I'm sure an end of the day discussion over the sunset. Dr. Richmond has over 47 years of experience as a coral reef science, has worked closely in the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Pacific Oceans. He was directly involved and has been directly involved with the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force since its inception in 1998, helped draft the original executive order on coral reef conservation in 98, and contributed to the drafting of both the Coral Reef Conservation Act of 2000 and subsequent bills for reauthorization. So that's 50 years worth of work in both coral reef science as well as policy. So we're very fortunate to have him with us here today, and I thank the committee for hearing from him.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Richmond, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Huffman, Ranking Members Benson Wasserman, Representative Soto and Case, and committee members. I'll explain from my personal experience over the past 47 years of what I've seen in overwhelming losses to these magnificent ecosystems and to the lives and livelihoods of those who depend on them. When I began my studies in 1974, the reefs where I performed my research had over 70% live coral cover. When I returned to these sites in 2013, these same reefs had less than 5% living cover. My younger colleagues on this trip were thrilled at seeing a few corals and fish. When I got back to my hotel room, I cried. I never would have imagined in my worst nightmare that these unique ecosystems of such natural beauty and of such high economic, ecological, and cultural value could experience such extensive losses during my professional career. I performed my doctoral dissertation research at Enowetak Atoll in 1980 through 82 and saw the massive destruction of reefs caused by the atomic bombs detonated during the nuclear testing programs of the 1950s. The death of corals and coral reefs at sites an ocean away is no less obvious or severe, but has occurred over years and decades rather than a few seconds. Of note, some of the reefs vaporized by atomic testing have shown substantial recovery, while the other reefs I mentioned have not, due to chronic stressors of sedimentation, pollution, overfishing, and repeated coral bleaching events tied to climate change. As a coral reef scientist who works closely with managers, policymakers, and stakeholders, I wish to provide you with a scientifically supported perspective on why passing this bill is so urgent and important. Coral reefs are ecosystems that provide resources of considerable economic, ecological, social, and cultural value. A recent study valued coastal housing and infrastructure protection alone at over $1.8 billion to our country, with annual benefits of over $800 million per year. Our investment in protecting and restoring these reefs should be commensurate. These centers of rich biodiversity, natural products of biomedical application, fisheries resources of economic and subsistence value provide livelihoods supported by reef-related activities, recreation, and tourism, and support cultural practices steeped in traditional ecological knowledge. They are also unfortunately in steep decline in U.S. waters and worldwide due to multiple human-induced disturbances. H.R. 160 provides an essential framework and funds for supporting partnerships among federal agencies, jurisdictional governments, researchers, managers, policymakers, and stakeholders to arrest and reverse the downward trajectory of our precious coral reefs and the benefits they provide to those who depend on them. The state of U.S. coral reefs has worsened since the passage of the Coral Reef Conservation Act of 2000 due to unanticipated levels of stress tied to storms, a major coral disease outbreak, and more frequent and severe coral bleaching events. Yet our understanding of coral reefs, the management tools available, and actionable science supporting responses has improved dramatically. The recent National Academies of Science Committee on Interventions to Increase the Persistence and Resilience of Coral Reefs recommended that restoration activities that accelerate recovery rates need to be enhanced, expanded, and broadly implemented at a meaningful scale. Support for this essential work is a cornerstone of the bill, as simply saving what presently remains of our reefs will not result in the desired outcome of leaving a legacy of vital coral reefs for our children, grandchildren, and generations to come. We must act now in moving from science to policy and knowledge to action. As with any legislation, there are some minor changes that can improve H.R. 160. However, extended delays in passing this bill are inadvisable. Time is our worst enemy, and every day lost in responding to the challenge of reversing the downward trajectory of reefs defies the urgency of the situation. I'll end on a positive note. Personally, I'm an optimist, otherwise I can't get out of bed in the morning. Professionally, I'm a pragmatist, otherwise I can't do my job. Coral reefs are threatened, but not doomed, and it's all up to us. Passing this bill would be a major boost for addressing and reversing coral reef decline, and I am optimistic we can succeed with the support and actions included in this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richman. We will now go to Ms. Castro, and Ms. Castro comes to us from Guam, and I know that my colleague, Mr. San Nicolas, had hoped to introduce you, Ms. Castro, but he was unable to join us in time. So I welcome you, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Greetings and half a day from Guam and the Mariana Islands, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Fran Castro, and I'm the Associate Director for the University of Guam Sea Grant Program, and also a past chairperson for the U.S. All Islands Committee to the U.S. Coral Reef Task Force. I thank you for this opportunity to testify on the reauthorization of the Coral Reef Conservation Act, H.R. 160, Restoring Resilient Reefs Act of 2021, on behalf of the people who live in the states and territories, as I do, where coral reefs are a way of life for all. The primary concern of island jurisdictions is the protection of our coral reefs and the safeguarding of all people who historically depend on these precious natural marine resources. This bill couldn't have come at a timelier manner as our coral reefs continue to decline while we speak. If authorized, this bill will provide opportunities to continue the ongoing work in the states and territories. Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands are small high islands where land-based pollutants need only travel short distances via stormwater runoff to reach a water body that can impact water supplies and harm coral reefs and other marine life. For as long as I've been in this arena, funding from the Coral Reef Conservation Program has been incredibly important to the successes of coral reef conservation and in addressing local stressors that harm coral reefs. As an example, the Coral Program invested funding into a watershed restoration on Rota, Northern Mariana Islands for 10 years. In those 10 years, we have put 300,000 grass and tree seedlings into the ground. Since work began, thousands of outplanted grasses, small trees, and shrubs have taken root, turning the dusty hillsides green once again. This is only one example, but these efforts on land do make a big difference in the water, reducing sediment loads to the nearby reefs and improving water quality. The result, healthier, more resilient coral reefs. There has been tremendous efforts on the ground in these jurisdictions to protect coral reefs from human impacts and natural disturbances. Despite our work on land and in water, global threats and impacts are growing and impeding our progress. The Coral Program continues to be instrumental in funding research that support the creation of new policies, enactment of legislation, creating plans to address local stressors, restoring coral reefs, and enhancing capacity for the states and territories, but there's still so much more to be done. I cannot stress enough how valuable the Coral Program funding has been and how greatly impactful in being able to reduce local stressors under our control as we struggle with the bigger threats of climate change. In Guam, the governor created a climate change resiliency group to develop a strategy to build resiliency against the adverse effects of climate change and to reduce contributing factors. These actions complement the work we are doing with the Coral Program. For almost 2 decades, I've been coming to the Hill with my former colleagues on the All Islands Committee to advocate for the reauthorization of the Coral Reef Conservation Act. It is now the year 2021, and I'm still here because I believe there is still hope. Overall, the act is written to provide the states and territories the ability to continue in their efforts to protect the coral reefs, which many depend on for their livelihoods. Today, I highlight for consideration the matching funds and waiver language. It appears that waivers are written in different sections of the bill, and I recommend combining the match and waiver language into its own section to provide clarity and alleviate confusion. Our communities and governments whose economies are driven by external funding and tourism have collapsed in light of the pandemic and will continue for the next several years. This makes it challenging to meet match requirements, and it adds to the competing priorities locally. Thus, we want to be clear about match and waivers. Our goal is not only to reverse the decline of coral reefs, but to rebuild these ecosystems. And in order to do that, we need a mechanism that provides actionable information to continue on a path to save our reefs. This bill provides that. To end, I would like to thank our partners at the NOAA Coral Reef Conservation Program, Jen Koss, and the Department of the Interior for their unique role in helping the jurisdictions in their efforts to protect and conserve coral reefs. Given the importance of coral reefs, the growing threats, and the work yet to be done to protect these magnificent ecosystems, it is imperative that Congress strengthen and reauthorize the Coral Reef Conservation Act. I commend the timely action taken by the subcommittee and sponsors of H.R. 160. This bill has been through many iterations over the years, but I'm honored and excited to be here in what I feel is a very momentous occasion and a giant step forward in coral reef conservation. Our communities, cultures, economies, and future generations depend on you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Castro. And the chair will now recognize Dr. Andrew Baker. Dr. Baker, I'm so glad you could join us because I try not to get all my information from Netflix, but I did watch a recent documentary on coral reefs on Netflix, and you featured pretty prominently in that. I'd asked my staff to reach out, but I was especially impressed that you're working on not just understanding all the bad stuff that's happening to our reefs, but to try to reactively and even proactively save the reefs. So that's an important perspective. We welcome you to the hearing, and I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Huffman, and thank you, committee, for the opportunity to provide testimony in support of the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act. As a marine scientist who studied and worked on coral reefs in Florida and around the world for almost 28 years, I believe that we must take urgent action to ensure that they can survive into the future. This act is essential to that effort because coral reefs in the United States and globally are at a critical turning point. The combined effects of climate change, disease, declining water quality, habitat destruction, and other impacts have contributed to these ecosystems suffering tremendous declines that have brought them to an ecological precipice. Nowhere is this crisis more striking than in Florida, where reefs have lost 70 to 80% or more of their live coral cover over just the last few decades. We're starting to experience back-to-back annual coral bleaching events caused by summertime temperatures that are so warm that heat-stressed corals turn white and then die. Moreover, these reefs are now suffering additional impacts of a terrifying new stony coral tissue loss disease, which first appeared in 2014 and is now endemic to most of Florida and has spread to US territories and other countries in the Caribbean. Healthy coral reefs in South Florida provide extensive value in protecting our low-lying coastlines from the devastating effects of storm surge and coastal inundation. And in fact, some of these reefs are worth tens of millions of dollars per kilometer per year in coastal protection. This is in addition to the direct revenues that coral reefs provide to coastal economies through tourism, recreational commercial fisheries, other jobs, and income. Moreover, coral reefs and marine environments hold immeasurable iconic value to the identity of Florida and other US states and territories. We must urgently reverse these declines or risk losing the tremendous value and benefits that coral reefs provide to Florida, the US, and other countries around the world. Much has changed since the Coral Reef Conservation Act of 2000. Although reef health has continued to decline, mainly due to the spiraling effects of climate change and disease, science has made tremendous steps forward in understanding corals and how they respond to these threats. Many new technologies and approaches are now available that were not anticipated 21 years ago, and there are exciting opportunities to bring these to the fight to save coral reefs. Furthermore, Florida's fledgling coral restoration industry needs to be scaled up in order to provide the foundation upon which all of these new scientific interventions can be built. Advances such as the ability to spawn baby corals in the laboratory allow selective breeding practices to be employed for the first time, for example, marking a new era of adaptive potential that restoration practitioners could access to help build more resilient reefs. I recently served, along with my colleague, Dr. Richmond, on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Interventions to Increase the Persistence and Resilience of Coral Reefs, which was sponsored by NOAA, to help determine how new technologies and knowledge could address the coral reef crisis. The committee identified priority actions to apply the scientific tools of the 21st century to maximize our chances of sustaining coral reefs over the coming decades. But the time to act on these interventions is now, while we still have corals from which these restored ecosystems can be built back. Perhaps nowhere in the world are these technologies best primed to be tested and applied than in Florida, which leads the world in coral restoration efforts and boasts a world-class community of coral reef scientists and managers. There is no time to be lost, and I believe the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act represents the best chance for us to put those plans into action. The US is not alone in recognizing the magnitude of the threat and the scale of the required response. Australia recently approved some $377 million to support research, management, and restoration to rescue its reef ecosystems from the same threats that ours face. Our coastal economies and infrastructure are equally as valuable and equally as important to the people who depend on them. I believe we must show leadership by investing in our coral reef's future so that our neighbors, particularly in the Caribbean, will join us in confronting the coral reef crisis. Florida's reefs are not isolated systems. Their resilience contributes to and depends upon regional reef health. We must therefore adopt an inclusive international approach to their conservation, and I believe the US must lead that. Confronting these challenges requires galvanizing all of our resources, including federal, state, and local, academic and non-academic, public and private, to bring the nation's best infrastructure and expertise to reverse these declines. We must also take effective action on climate change to remedy some coral reef threats at their very source. The Restoring Resilient Reefs Act of 2021 leverages all of the tools in our repertoire efficiently and effectively to maximize coral reef survival. I believe we must not fail at giving our coral reefs the chance for a resilient future. These ecosystems have dominated the world's shallow tropical seas for tens of millions of years, but now face disappearance because of human activities. Supporting the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act signals at home and abroad that we will not let our coral reefs tumble over the edge of the precipice, and that we will do all we can to ensure their continued survival. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baker. The chair now recognizes our colleague Amata Radewagen to introduce our next witness, Mrs. Anderson Tagarino. So Ms. Radewagen, please.
Talofa lava. Today I'm honored to introduce Kelly Anderson Tagarino from my home district of American Samoa. She's part of the University of Hawaii's Sea Grant program, along with the American Samoa Community College. Thank you so much, Kelly Fa'atai, for also being with us so early in the morning in American Samoa.
Yeah. Good morning, Ms. Anderson Tagarino. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Fa'atai Tele for the introduction, Representative Radewagen. Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, Full Committee Ranking Member Westerman, Representative Soto, and committee members. And thank you for the comprehensive review of issues facing our reefs during your introductions. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today regarding the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act of 2021. I serve as the American Samoa Sea Grant Extension Agent, a position I have held for 8 years. Today, I'm providing testimony as a private citizen in support of HR 160. I'm a marine ecologist by training, and I have lived in American Samoa since 2009, during which time I have conducted coral bleaching intervention research and directed the marine science program at the American Samoa Community College. My research has helped us better understand how corals respond and recover to bleaching, and many of my past students are now in coral reef management positions in American Samoa. As an extension agent, my job is to understand issues facing coastal residents and convey cutting-edge science in a comprehensible manner. So let me be clear. Coral reefs are invaluable and are in crisis. Science-based interventions such as those Mr. Richmond and Baker discussed are urgently needed. I believe our witnesses have clearly demonstrated the value of coordination and sharing of information between U.S. coral jurisdictions, which this bill supports, that leads to facilitation of these critical science-based management interventions. You may have heard that American Samoa has the healthiest and most resilient coral reefs of any inhabited U.S. jurisdiction. This is very fortunate, as our residents are also, unfortunately, among the poorest in the country and the most reliant on reefs for food. In addition, American Samoa's islands are sinking or subsiding due to the strong earthquakes that generated the devastating tsunami in 2009. While global sea level rise averages a little over an inch per decade, Tutuila, our main island, has lost about 7.6 inches in the decade from 2009 to 19, from a combination of global sea level rise and island subsidence. Personally, I have watched over 20 feet of land around my house be lost to the ocean. Coral reefs are our best protection from the erosion and flooding from waves that reach ever further inland. However, only healthy reefs can continue to grow and keep up with the height that is required to enable this critical shoreline protection. American Samoa is unique within the U.S. in retaining traditional land tenure, whereby land is owned by chiefs and the majority of land is communal land. Traditionally, this land ownership extended out to the reef crest, which is the shallowest part of the reef that breaks the ocean waves. Both land management and reef management were and are practiced for the communal good in mind. This bill allows for greater autonomy for coral reef management and thus empowers Indigenous management strategies, which I believe is the most successful path to reef conservation and restoration in the islands. In American Samoa, the Governor's Coral Reef Advisory Group serves to coordinate coral-related management across the territory and is mainly funded by the Coral Reef Conservation Program. I have served as their representative for over a decade and am proud of the work accomplished thus far to protect these valuable resources from the myriad threats that they face. Funding from the Coral Reef Conservation Program has allowed the Coral Reef Advisory Group to grow from a 1 coordinator position to an office of 6 staff that is able to carry out critical reef monitoring, respond to emerging issues, conduct research, and education that grows local capacity. Several of their staff are my past students and have also served as fellows. I echo Ms. Castro's comments on requesting clarity on matching funds waivers for the territories, and certainly appreciate their inclusion in the bill to ensure equitable access. Passing this bill will ensure continuity of funding to continue to build on these successes. Coral reefs are an integral part of life in the Pacific Islands. Healthy reefs support healthy reef fish populations. Reef fish and other organisms were and remain today central to Samoan culture. Not only are they culturally important, but food from the reef is relied upon by more than 70% of people in American Samoa. Over 55% of our residents live below the poverty line, making reliance on food from the reef very high. The importance of being able to rely on local food has been highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. While American Samoa has remained COVID-free thus far, we are not free from its impacts, including shortages of food and other materials. Science is clear that this is the decade to act and minimize the climate crisis. As Chairman Huffman alluded to, reefs have been called the canary in the coal mine for climate change, and their message is clear: we must act now. This bill provides a framework to apply the science we have gained in the past decades and support reef recovery. My decade serving as a college marine science instructor in American Samoa has shown me that Samoan students are ready to join this battle, and passing this bill will support them in their fight for their future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the panel for their testimony and just remind the members that under Committee Rule 3D, there's a 5-minute limit on questions. We're going to now turn to those member questions, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I'd like to begin with Ms. Koss, and I want to thank you for your testimony and for your work running the Coral program at NOAA. In your testimony, you cited a number of issues with HR 160 that the committee will need to continue to work through. And I want to just drill down on a little bit of that. Do you believe research and management goals are currently aligned in the Coral program, and how do you think HR 60 could affect them?
I do believe they're quite well aligned at the moment. I think the bill puts a finer point on it, makes some express provisions for restoration that weren't recognized in the original Coral Reef Conservation Act. So I think the bill itself enhances what we're already doing and provides some further direction and more resources to the states and territories for whose corals they are.
All right, thank you very much. Dr. Richmond, I'd like to ask how the various jurisdictions support and enhance each other's work, and why it's so important for the United States to support the coral work being undertaken by the freely associated states. Do you have ideas on how we might better utilize the Office of Insular Affairs at the Department of Interior to deliver the support that is needed?
Thank you, Chairman Huffman. I strongly support the efforts to further engage the Office of Insular Affairs at the Department of Interior. Just as a bit of history, the Coral Reef Task Force was formed because of a staff member of OIA that helped draft the Executive Order 13089 back in 1998. So the Office of Insular Affairs has been a key partner throughout the entire life of the Coral Reef Task Force and is very well positioned to be able to support particularly the territories and commonwealths. And that balance between Interior and NOAA has worked very well. There are times when the administrative infrastructure in the insular areas may have needed a little bit of support. And the expert staff at Office of Insular Affairs, some of you may know Nick Pula, who is the director of OIA. He's an islander himself, and he knows exactly the problems there, and they have always been very responsive. The inclusion of the freely associated states, I think, is absolutely essential. And in the Pacific, we say the rising tide floats all canoes. The political boundaries that are written by various compacts and other agreements are not respected by coral larvae and fish at all. And if you are going to approach holistically the future of coral reefs, whether it's in the Pacific or Caribbean, my colleague and friend, Dr. Baker, mentioned the same, that Florida is not isolated from the rest of the Caribbean, and all of the U.S. jurisdictions are not isolated from the freely associated states. I'll end by saying Palau recently established the Palau National Marine Sanctuary, which is 80% of their exclusive economic zone and protection. When you add that to Papahanaumokuakea and the Pacific Remote Islands, we are fast approaching an improvement in the amount of oceans that's protected, coral reefs and pelagic fisheries as a legacy for the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Baker, I want to ask about the specific preventive measures you mentioned might be scaled up because I think it's important when we talk about authorizing funds and making a big government investment in this space that we know that there are some interventions that can make a difference. But also, I'd like you to address the broader context. And maybe we can save some of these reefs from a spike in temperature. Maybe we can even bring a few of them back. But if the ocean continues to warm, if we don't address that broader impact that is changing ocean conditions, I assume that all of this triage might be for naught. So I'll invite you to speak on both those interventions and the broader context of tackling climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Hoffman. Yeah, both of those are great points. Despite what I said about the fact that there are new interventions in the works and options for scientists to take action to buy some time for coral reefs, you are correct that unless we can really deal with the root source of this, which is carbon emissions, we are only sort of, as I said, buying time for these corals to survive. And by buying them a few extra decades of time, perhaps that's what we can do. That's what they're able to support. But there are actions that we can take that will certainly buy us that availability. And I think the time is now to try to roll out those strategies. I like to think that, I sort of think of coral reefs as a jigsaw puzzle that we have scrambled through human activities. We've moved all the pieces around. We've thrown some on the floor. Some of them have been flipped over. But so far, we haven't actually thrown any pieces away. And for anyone who's ever done a jigsaw puzzle, it's incredibly frustrating to be lost, to find yourself without pieces at the end of it. So we still have all of those pieces. And I think the challenge is how do we make sure we don't throw those pieces away over the next few decades while we get the climate crisis under control. And that's really the challenge of scientists. We leave the political action to you guys. Our job is to try to make sure we keep as many puzzle pieces on the table so that we can restore these reefs back in the future.
All right. Thank you very much. My understanding on the Republican side, we're going to hear from Ms. Radewagen next. So unless the ranking member has a different order, we'll go to Ms. Radewagen for the next 5 minutes. Amada, are you ready?
Yep. Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Talofa again, and good afternoon. I want to thank you, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, for holding this hearing today. I also want to thank Representative Soto for his hard work on constructing the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act of 2021, of which I'm a proud co-sponsor. I also want to thank all of our witnesses for testifying today. Coral reefs are an important part of the American Samoa ecosystem. American Samoa has some of the oldest and largest coral in the world. And as Ms. Anderson Tagarino pointed out in her testimony, and I mentioned previously in our hearing on climate change, American Samoa is sinking after sustaining damage from the 2009 earthquakes and tsunami. Ms. Anderson Tagarino, could you elaborate on that?
Sure, thank you for the question. So globally, the average rate of sea level rise is about 1/8 of an inch a year, 3.2 millimeters. Unfortunately for us in American Samoa, as Ms. Radewagen alluded to, we are sinking. We only learned in 2019 that our main island of Tutuila has been subsiding at a rate of 0.63 inches per year since the 2009 earthquake doublet that generated a devastating tsunami in the Samoan archipelago. So in the past decade, we have sunk more than 1/2 foot. Our current relative rate of sea level rise, which combines both global sea level rise and the island subsidence, is 0.76 inches per year. So that's where we get the number of 7.6 inches in the past decade. If this continues, by 2060, we will have seen a sea level rise increase of 38.6 inches or 3.2 feet over the 2009 sea level. This rapid relative sea level rise rate is causing coastal flooding and saltwater intrusion into our drinking water and has led to infrastructure damage and losses. We are completely reliant on groundwater for our fresh drinking water. And as seas rise, more and more saltwater is infiltrating our drinking wells. In addition, of course, waves are eroding shorelines further inland and causing increased shoreline loss. Due to the topography of our islands, many places our main road is the only road, and it's right against the shoreline, and it is already having waves wash over it. We don't know how long this subsidence will continue, and we do see a slowdown in the rate currently. There's ongoing research by NASA to better understand this issue, and I'll be co-leading the development of a relative sea level rise viewer in the territory later this year that should enable villages to better plan for these future impacts. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned that the bill would allow for greater autonomy. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure. So the bill provides block grants to the states, commonwealths, and territories, which allows for increased flexibility for jurisdictional managers to react and respond to coral reef needs. American Samoa provided a talk in the 2016 International Coral Reef Symposium session on crown-of-thorns starfish, which are starfish that eat coral that have periodic giant explosions in their populations. We were suffering from an outbreak from 2012 to about 2016. Our talk in the world's largest coral reef conference was the only talk that showed a positive outcome from physical eradication of these starfish. Of course, we could have acted much quicker if those emergency funds were available and saved much more of our reef. That's one concrete example of our successes that have happened and could have been improved if this bill had been provided at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Radewagen. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Dingell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, and to Ranking Member Benz for convening this extremely important hearing to discuss ways to safeguard coral reefs. As the witnesses have outlined, reefs both in the U.S. and around the world face a variety of threats, from climate change to ecosystem loss and disease outbreaks. And I really want to salute my colleague, Congresswoman Soto, for the bipartisan effort he is leading to empower NOAA to better safeguard this vital part of the ocean ecosystem. My first question is for Ms. Castro. Ms. Castro, in your testimony, you talked about the importance of active reef restoration in Guam and the Northern Marianas. What do you mean by that? Ms. Castro, you're on mute.
What I mean was like restoring and conserving reefs is really crucial to island communities because it really protects our coastlines from storms and erosion. And as you heard, many livelihoods depend on these reefs. They're a source of food and income for local communities and offering opportunities for recreation. And if we continue our efforts to build island resilience by addressing these local stressors, we'll be able to build island resilience and learn to adapt with the changing climate. Local economies like Guam and CNMI receive millions of dollars from tourists to reefs through diving tours, recreational fishing trips, hotels, restaurants, and other businesses based near reef ecosystems. But unfortunately, because of the pandemic, our economies took a downturn and may not recover for another few years. So we have to continue to work to build resilience by addressing these like local stressors.
Thank you. Dr. Richmond, from your objective perspective, can you speak to the limitations of block grants versus other funding structures for allowing states and territories the flexibility necessary to carry out conservation programs?
Sure. From my experience as being the science advisor to the All Islands Committee, which is made up of 7 U.S. jurisdictions, states, territories, and commonwealths, as well as the freely associated states. Block grants have worked really well for states because they have a little bit more administrative infrastructure. Cooperative agreements have generally worked better for territories and commonwealths, where a little bit of additional assistance and modification could work very well. What I'm very pleased to see is that the All Islands Committee of these jurisdictions has always worked extremely well together, and NOAA has been a great partner, as well as Department of Interior. And so this is where the devil gets in the details, that adding the flexibility of the block grants while taking into account the needs of the territories and commonwealths, I believe can be done fairly simply. I've added some of these details in my testimony, but I don't see anything in there that is formidable that cannot ensure that the territories and commonwealths get their equal share. And that's always been the rule of the All Islands Committee. The reefs of Florida are as important to them as the reefs of the CNMI or the people to the Mariana Islands. And that's been a wonderful model.
Thank you. Ms. Cost, NOAA's coral reef appropriations have increased from 26.1 million in fiscal 17 to 33 million in fiscal year 21, approximately 26%. How does NOAA use this funding increase to better meet the conservation needs of the states and territories having their grants increased? And have they been able to request additional technical assistance from the agency to fill information or capacity gaps?
Absolutely. With this last increase in our budget, we were able to fund quite a bit more restoration work, specifically in Florida for Mission Iconic Reefs, and provide some additional resources for technical resources as well through the Nature Conservancy in creating a manual to train local managers how to design their own restoration plans, and essentially now the Pacific territories all have shovel-ready projects ready to go should another appropriations bill come about that allows for more infrastructure and restoration activities. So I think we're in really good shape on that front, and have been able to provide technical assistance in the arena of disease prevention and response as well. So the additional resources were very much appreciated and put to good use. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Gonzalez Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me now?
Yes, you sound great. And yep, there looks like a real live background behind you too.
Yeah, I'm in a car, so I'm in my way. I'm in Puerto Rico visiting some tribes, but I want to say thank you for holding this hearing. And the first thing is the coral reefs are vital for U.S. jurisdictions like Puerto Rico as well. Our main island is just surrounded by over 1,900 square miles of shallow coral reef ecosystems that provides habitat and food to hundreds of ecologically valuable marine species. And coral reef also help support our economy. And that's a reality that many people in the mainland may not know. According just to NOAA, reef-derived tourism generates more than $2 billion in income and regional domestic product just for Puerto Rico, supporting in my case more than 3,000 full and part-time jobs on the island. Moreover, coral reef plays an important role in reducing coastal risk and increasing resiliency. The U.S. Geological Service study found that annually, reef in Puerto Rico provides flood protection benefits to more than 4,200 people and more than 184 million in averted damages to property and economic activity. And we saw that with the hurricanes, we saw that with the 100-year wave as well. And they also have the capacity to absorb up to 97% of oncoming wave energy, reducing the impacts of storm surges and flooding during hurricanes. And we're going to face now again the hurricane season in June. However, despite these amazing benefits, coral ecosystems in Puerto Rico face serious risks. NOAA has previously estimated that 93% of reef on the island are threatened. More than 11% of our coral reef were damaged from Hurricane Irma and Maria. That's a lot. And NOAA's latest status report found that while reef in Puerto Rico are in fair condition overall, they were on the cusp of impaired. Importantly, this data did not account on the emergence of 2019 of stony coral tissue loss disease on our coasts, which has been devastating. And Congressman Soto know about this because this is not just for Puerto Rico. And that's why I strongly support the efforts to reauthorize and strengthen NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program as HR 160 established and Restoring Resilient Reefs Act seeks to do. I'm proud to co-sponsor this legislation introduced by my dear friend Darren Soto in the House and Senator Rubio in the Senate. And I am particularly supportive of these provisions to support and encourage local reef conservation efforts throughout block grants to states and territories and the establishment of grants for coral reef emergency declarations. I do recognize that recently some concerns has been raised, and I stand ready to work in a bipartisan way and a bicameral way as well as with the administration to address any issues on this legislation. However, this cannot be an excuse to delay action on this important piece of legislation, which has been developed over the last 3 years with the input of appropriate stakeholders. And with that, I would like to turn, let me see if I got enough time. Yes, I can do a question. I want to go with Jennifer Kloss, the director of the Coral Reef Program. It's good to see you. And let me thank you for your team and the NOAA Coral Conservation Program for the amazing and important job you do in Puerto Rico. Last year, your office released a report on the status of coral reefs in the island and found the fair condition, but that they can be impaired. Can you discuss the prevalence of the disease of the stony coral tissue loss disease in our waters in 2019 and what action your office is pursuing to address and mitigate its impact on the island coral reefs?
Absolutely. It's nice to see you as well. My understanding is the disease first started sort of in the northeast quadrant of Puerto Rico and has made its way around most of the main island to Culebra, and then mostly the southern area of the island has also been affected, but the west coast not so much. What we're doing is to essentially try to replicate everything that we've been doing in Florida to respond to and prevent further spread of the disease by providing technical assistance and funding, standing up a coordinator in Puerto Rico to manage the disease, and trying to get as much resources to the Commonwealth for people to get in the water and apply antibiotics to the lesions. So we're very much trying to replicate what we're doing in Florida and also looking into potentially rescuing Puerto Rican corals and getting land-based aquaria established in Puerto Rico or sending them elsewhere to be stored until the disease makes its way through and they could be put back out on the reef for restoration efforts.
Thank you. I know my time expired. I will submit the rest of my questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing those extra seconds. And again, I support Darren Soto's bill. Thank you. I yield back.
Thanks very much. Chair now recognizes Congressman Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to all of the witnesses for your expertise and passion. And one observation I have right across the board is that we can all agree at least that our coral reefs are both critical and critically endangered. That's a change from the last 20 years. That wasn't a universal agreement 20 years ago when we started down this path. And so kind of following up on that thought, Dr. Richmond, 47 years of longitudinal experience in coral reefs in both the scientific and the policy side, and you were there at the inception of our modern governmental response, at least at the federal level, some 20 plus years ago. What is the biggest area that you think that we need to tackle policy-wise to adjust to the changes on the scientific side in the last 20 years? I mean, 20 years is a lot of light years in terms of coral reef degradation and climate change, et cetera. What's really changed that the current law is just not handling right now?
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman Case. That you really hit the nail on the head there. That Dr. Baker and I, as part of this National Academy study, one of the concerns we have is that science advances very quickly and the policy is simply not kept up. And so it's been part of our goal is to really push the science to policy piece and knowledge to action. And when I say knowledge to action, is deep respect for traditional ecological knowledge from the islands where they've been sustainably using their resources for thousands of years. The challenges are unlike anything we've seen before. And as I mentioned, in my 47 years, I've seen things I never would have thought possible. But it all comes down to partnerships, being able to work closely between the scientific community, the management community, policymakers, and stakeholders to be able to not only come to a consensus on what the key issues are, but what everyone has to offer to the solutions. And it's really about implementation. That's what I think is so urgent about this bill, is it gives us a tool for moving from thoughts to action and into implementation. And that's where some of us, I started with a full head of hair back 47 years ago. It's taken its toll. The bottom line is when we look at where we are and where we could be, the partnerships among those four groups and the ability to move quickly from the best available science to implementation is urgent. And that's why the urgency of this bill. Certainly there's a few things that could be fixed, but it's a solid bill that enables us to move forward. And building these bridges between the policy community, the stakeholders, the scientific community, and the managers is really the way forward to be able to solve this huge problem.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is that aside from some fixes, and we do have time to fix this bill, we don't have to report it out tomorrow, we have a little bit of time. You think that this bill, which I co-sponsored with Congressman Soto's leadership, does catch us up, generally catch us up policy-wise, because it focuses on providing a policy framework for the partnerships that are needed in order to pull this off. Is that about right?
Absolutely. I think, again, you're right on target that this bill has so much to love in it, that it's one of these things that I've even had this discussion with some of the policymakers about sections that are a little bit vague versus prescriptive. And that's actually a good thing, because the partnerships that have evolved with NOAA, Department of Interior, and the island jurisdictions have allowed that flexibility to be a good thing. Sometimes having things so prescriptive ties your hands. If it's too vague, you can get mission creep. But I really think this is a great balance. And the one issue that people have come up with is the waivers and the matching issue, which is really important for the territories and commonwealths. There are 6 different places where you can find it in the bill. I've been through this bill a bunch of times, word by word, sentence by sentence. I have a list of those. There's nothing there that can't be fixed with a very little bit of tweaking the language, and that shouldn't take more than a day of staff to be able to do that.
Okay, and let me switch gears a little bit in my remaining time. You had a comment in your testimony that expressed concern with the addition of Fisheries Management Council membership to the Coral Reef Task Force. That of course is a subject for this subcommittee in terms of our Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization, which we're right in the middle of right now. You made this specific statement in your testimony that you feared that the Fishery Management Council membership was often at odds with the goals of the Coral Reef Task Force. How do you fix that in this bill? Do you want to just not have that membership, or do you want to, put boundaries around it, or what? And my time is almost up, so I might have to get that from you in a written response, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
I'll loan you 30 seconds if that works for Dr. Richmond.
Yes, that's all I have to say. Yes, that it could be fixed very easily by removing this. They haven't been a part in the past, and experience has shown us that the task force operates very well with the constituencies and the membership that's there already.
Okay, thank you very much. 28 seconds, not bad.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there's a most interesting discussion. This gives me an opportunity to recommend an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, Competition with China Can Save the Planet. It's in this month's edition, May, June 9th, 2021. The reason I bring it up is because it has in it an estimate of how much coal is going to be burned by China. The estimate is 100 billion metric tons of coal will be burned between now and 2060 by China. 100 billion metric tons of coal. This suggests, when one looks at the current temperature of the oceans, which, as I understand it, the increasing temperature is one part of the problem. There are others, but is a long-term and incredibly difficult challenge. So my question and I'll ask Dr. Richmond first. My question is, what is it about this bill that gives you hope that we can hold our systems together during what appears to be a very long time of warmer water.
Yes, as Dr. Baker indicated, this really is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. The addressing local stressors today allows us to buy time to deal with a larger issue of climate change in the long run. When we were on this National Academies Committee, we also came to the conclusion that it's not all on the biologist. You know, to misquote the Martian, you know, sciencing the crap out of this is one thing. But while we're working on the biological side of looking for resistant genotypes and looking at ways in which we can enhance restoration activities, there's a really good group of people at MIT and Caltech working on carbon sequestration. We avoided that, but there's the double edge of that. While we're trying to improve biological responses and restoration on one hand, there's a lot of very smart people on looking at tools of being able to reduce that amount of carbon that's already there. And your issue about continued emissions is spot on. If we don't do that, we will lose. But again, we still are in the fight. We have better tools. If we can move the science to the policy realm, I do believe, and it's not just blank optimism, I believe it's pragmatism as well. We can do this, but it's going to take an all hands on deck effort.
And the follow-up would be, when you say you can do this, are you talking about the science to try to design coral that can live in warmer temperatures, or are you talking about something that would reduce the water temperature?
Both.
Both.
Yeah, it's both. We need to be able to look at those corals that are resistant, and it's not just temperature. The Irish potato famine taught us that if you look for one characteristic, you're going to lose in the end. Temperature alone won't do it. It's resistance to stressors such as poor water quality, diseases, and that's another one. So trying to select just for temperature, you're going to lose. But while we work on solutions of trying to find the genetic diversity that will allow things to go through, we can also work on reducing emissions and sequestration of carbon. And that's why it's going to take interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approaches.
And well, let's build on that just a little more. And I'm sorry to ask you yet another question, but I will. It has been suggested by some that if we planted 1/9 of the world's ocean to seaweed, we could sequester most of the world's carbon. Tell me if this seaweed has any place in any of these discussions.
I'll say that I'm not a seaweed expert, but I know that seagrass beds that are associated with coral reefs can be carbon sinks. Trying to do large-scale manipulation of ecosystems has taught us in the past that that's a dangerous way to go forward. But there are ways of using the existing resources that are there, largely through protection and restoration, that can get us into a better balance than we are in today.
Thank you. And shifting to Mr. Baker, your testimony notes there are new technologies available now which weren't when the original Coral Reef Conservation Act was signed. How does this legislation update the law to reflect those advances?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to expand on that a bit more. So as my colleague, Dr. Richmond, sort of alluded to, there has been a whole bunch of new interventions that are available. And I think some of the most exciting interventions have to do with the science of selective breeding. As Bob mentioned, there are multiple stresses out there that corals have to deal with. The good news is that there are corals around the world that are already dealing with those different stresses. And so the question is, how do we bring together the genetic traits that allow them to do that into a suite of corals, a diverse suite of corals that can manage all of those stresses at the same time? And interestingly, only in the last few years has the science of laboratory-induced coral spawning, so you can actually now raise corals in the lab and raise them to a reproductive stage and have them spawn in the laboratory, combined with the ability to cryopreserve their eggs so that you can actually control breed some of these traits. And I think that's a tremendously exciting opportunity, and something that really until just the last 2 or 3 years hasn't really been available to scientists. And so the scale of the problem is tremendous. And part of the reason I think for this hearing is to recognize that in order for us to seize that opportunity, we have to scale up very fast. We have to try as many different interventions as we can, quickly discard those that don't work and focus on the ones that do. But there are, so many different avenues to pursue, many of which are showing promise already, that we can't do them without appropriate levels of support.
Thank you. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Chair now recognizes Congresswoman Doris Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today for their expertise and their experience. It's really been incredible. I'm so glad that we're paying attention to this because we all know that coral reefs are threatened by the climate crisis, and which has led to ocean acidification and unprecedented mass coral bleaching. And these climate-related events are devastating for global biodiversity and communities worldwide. So I'm so pleased that we're talking about this today because many times people don't focus as much on the oceans as they should. And we know that what's happening to the coral reefs are tragic and we must get moving on that quickly. Dr. Baker, in your testimony, you mentioned that coral reefs have lost nearly 80% of live coral coverage in recent decades. Now, I assume that that means around the world also. Can you speak to what causes this drastic decline and what this means for coastal communities and communities that depend on coral reef goods and services?
Yes, of course. Thanks for the opportunity to address that. So it's a combination of different stresses. In different parts of the world, the prescription that has led to coral reef decline varies. In some reefs have been heavily influenced by coastal development, declining water quality, habitat destruction caused, for example, by the human development, port construction, dredging operations. Those sort of immediate local scale impacts can really destroy reefs, and there are plenty of examples that I could point to where that's happened. The problem is that even reefs in the most remote, far-flung areas of the world are suffering similar declines through, non-point source global stresses, principally climate change, but also ocean acidification and also diseases that are spreading. And so there's really no part of the world that has been able to escape this area. There are no pristine reefs left. What we have are a sort of a patchwork of reefs in different shapes and sizes and different states of health. And the challenge is, how do we take the best parts of each of those reefs and bring them together and learn the lessons that can be learned from each one of them to produce a resilient sort of reef strategy going forward?
I think we may have lost Congresswoman Matsui's signal. If she comes back to us, I will pick up where she left off on her time. But otherwise, I hope Mr. Fulcher is available on the Republican side. Russ, if you're with us, you're recognized for 5 minutes. And he is not. So I am going to ask the ranking member if he has any members that would like to go at this time.
Mr. Chair, I do not.
Okay. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like we're able to get Ms. Matsui back with us. And so I think that brings us to the end of what has been a really productive and interesting and very substantive and problem-solving conversation. I want to thank everybody, the members who engaged so thoughtfully, and the terrific witnesses. Dr. Richmond, your references to optimism and pessimism reminded me, someone famous once said, we need pessimism of the intellect and fierce optimism of the will. If anyone can name who said that, there'll be a door prize here before we gavel out. But I think it's a wonderful attitude, and I just found the whole conversation quite refreshing. So again, thanks very much. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing. The hearing record will be held open for 10 days to allow for responses. If there's no further business, does anyone know who said that famous line? This is your last chance to collect the door prize.
Mr. Chairman, back on.
Yes. Who?
Representative Soto, back on the committee. I think you were going to us next.
Oh, you were, I did not have you on my list, Congressman Soto. Okay, well, listen, just let us suspend the gaveling out and recognize you for 5 minutes, and then we will awkwardly close unless some of the other members join us. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz. I apologize. I had a constituent meeting I was rushing back to, and two people who were in front of me, they somehow weren't there. So let me start with the broader view. When we look at coral reefs, food, habitat, coastal resiliency, even medical breakthroughs happen in this diverse environment. And under the Restoring Resilient Reefs Act, we would see funding increases, America Samoa, 30%, Guam, 41%, Puerto Rico, 69%, U.S. Virgin Islands, 66%, Northern Mariana Islands, 26%, Hawaii, 55%, and Florida, 44%. So overall, we would be investing more along with this reauthorization. We know NOAA is doing their best, and we appreciate all those efforts. They are doing grants, and they are working on some public-private partnerships, disaster relief. This bill codifies those efforts and formalizes them more. And we're looking forward to continuing to work with you, Ms. Koss, on any changes you think will be needed to make this both pragmatic and workable. But this is about codifying the more formal best practices that have formed over the last few years with NOAA. And we're not only legislating for the current NOAA, but over the course of many administrations to come, and set it to a more formal process. So we look forward to working with you on that. Dr. Baker, we know the University of Miami plays a key role in protecting the Great Florida Reef, as does Mote Marine. And so how important is it to have these public-private partnerships formalized through the Coral Stewardship Partnership to leverage more dollars from the private sector in restoring the Great Florida Reef?
Thanks for the opportunity to answer that. I think it's tremendously important. No set of institutions can solve this crisis by itself, and I think the more emphasis and attention that we are able to attract to encourage private levels of investment as well as government, and as I mentioned in my testimony, whether that support comes from state, local, or federal sources, we sort of need all of our resources and infrastructure in the fight to have the greatest maximum impact as quickly as we can.
Absolutely. And Dr. Richmond, we are definitely going to work with you on the waivers. We know the issue, particularly for the territories, is critical. Being a Puerto Rican descent, we fight this battle on any number of other issues, knowing that the territories can't always afford to have the matching. So we're going to work with you on that. Hawaii's coral reef restoration, or protection rather, can be vastly different from Florida and could be even different from the other Pacific territories in the Caribbean. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely.
And so do you think having the block grant program more formalized, it can not only leverage state dollars for Hawaii, but make sure we're using a unique approach for your set of reefs in Hawaii? And you think that would help contribute to that?
Yeah, once again, it's the way in which you go to implementation, but you're absolutely correct. And interestingly enough, it's also lessons learned. One of the great benefits of having the Coral Reef Task Force and the All Islands Committee is shared experiences among federal partners and jurisdictional partners. And right now, we actually have a grant from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is also supported by NOAA, to bring the science. So Dr. Baker is a colleague of mine on this. We're comparing approaches in Hawaii and Florida. Hawaii is a volcanic island, which has a lot of defined watersheds and runoff. Florida's Swiss cheese, it's karst topography. So we're trying to figure out how to match these results.
Thank you. Because my time is limited. And then Ms. Anderson-Tagarino, you mentioned the uniqueness of Samoa. How do you think this would, if we have the statutory authority for block grants and for public-private partnerships, you think that would increase both local investment and international investment?
Yes. Yes, I do. Absolutely.
Thanks so much. And then Ms. Castro, Guam also has its own unique coral reef system. Do you think having local decisions on this contributing to it would help out in your unique issues in Guam?
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks so much, Mr. for the opportunity, and I yield back.
Thanks again, Mr. Soto, for bringing us this bill and for joining us today. With all of the closing stipulations that I read previously, we will bring this hearing to an end unless Ranking Member Benz is able to identify the source of the quote I gave earlier, in which case he'll win the door prize. Ranking Member?
He is not. Sorry.
It was an Italian political thinker by the name of Antonio Gramsci. So it's pretty obscure, but maybe we'll try to have a contest like that in future hearings. Thanks, everyone. The committee now stands adjourned.